They seated me at the staff table, wedged between the coat check girl and a waiter on his smoke break. I paid for this engagement party, every crystal chandelier, every orchid centerpiece. But when the champagne toasts began and the cameras flashed, I wasn't part of it, not even close. I smiled, stayed quiet, and after the last bite of petit fours, I made 3 phone calls that turned their perfect evening into ashes. Subscribe if this story finds you, and tell me where in the world are you listening from. The Riverside Country Club's service corridor smelled like industrial bleach and the lingering ghost of 1,000 overpriced dinners. I sat rigid in my folding chair, watching busboys rush past with towers of dirty plates and my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my wedding ring cut into my finger. The thin metal had worn smooth after 43 years of marriage, 8 years of widowhood, and tonight it felt like the only solid thing left in my world. Through the swinging doors, marked "Staff Only," I could hear the tinkling of champagne flutes and the melodic rise and fall of polished laughter. My granddaughter Sophia's engagement party was in full swing, just 30 feet away, but I might as well have been on the moon. The maitre d', a nervous young man with perfectly styled hair, had approached me 20 minutes earlier with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a mix-up with the seating arrangements. The Ashfords have requested some adjustments to accommodate their photographer's vision for the evening." He gestured toward the folding chair like he was offering me a throne. "We've set up a lovely spot for you right here, where you'll be comfortable and can still hear everything." Comfortable. That's what he called it. A metal chair squeezed between the industrial coffee machine and a cart full of soiled linens. I'd nodded, smoothed my navy blue dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this evening, and sat down without a word of protest. Because it was Sophia's night, because I'd raised her to be gracious, and gracious women didn't make scenes. Because I'd learned after 71 years of living that sometimes your place in the world isn't where you think it should be. But God, it hurt. It hurt in a way that reached down into my bones and settled there like winter cold. I'd written the check for this party 3 months ago, $18,000, without blinking, because Sophia had looked at me with those wide hazel eyes and said, "Grandma Rose, I know it's a lot to ask, but the Ashfords are insisting on Riverside, and we just don't have that kind of money." The Ashfords. Preston Ashford III and his wife Vivian, old money from Charleston, with the kind of pristine pedigree that traced back to cotton plantations and shipping fortunes. Their son Bradley was a perfectly pleasant young man, an investment banker with kind eyes and good manners, but his parents treated everyone outside their social circle like props in an elaborate theater production. And apparently, I was a prop that didn't fit their aesthetic. I pulled my small, beaded purse closer to my chest and tried to block out the sounds of celebration filtering through the kitchen doors. 24 years ago, I'd held Sophia in the hospital nursery while her mother lay unconscious after the car accident that would eventually take her life. My daughter Carmen had squeezed my hand and whispered, "Take care of her mama. Make sure she knows she's loved." I'd raised Sophia from age 2, navigating bedtime stories and scraped knees and teenage heartbreak while working as a high school principal in a district that barely had enough funding for textbooks. Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every graduation, it had been me in the audience, sometimes still in my work clothes, applauding until my hands hurt. I'd driven her to piano lessons in my 15-year-old Honda, saved every penny for her college tuition, celebrated when she got her first job in marketing. I'd been her everything when she had nothing else, and now I was excess baggage at her engagement party. The coat check girl, a college-aged blonde with perfectly manicured nails, glanced at me sympathetically. "You're the grandmother, right? I heard them talking. This is really messed up." She lowered her voice. "My manager said the bride's future in-laws specifically requested you be seated away from the main event for photos. That's just cruel." I managed a tight smile. "These things happen, dear. It's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. Through a crack in the swinging doors, I caught a glimpse of Sophia glowing in her champagne-colored cocktail dress, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon. She was laughing at something Preston Ashford was saying, her hand resting on Bradley's arm, looking every inch the perfect society bride-to-be. She hadn't looked toward the kitchen once. Not once. The waiter beside me, a middle-aged Hispanic man with tired eyes, shook his head in disgust. 30 years I've worked parties like this, never seen anything like it. You should be at the head table, senora. Not back here with us. It's kind of you to say that, I murmured, watching a busboy push past with a cart that nearly knocked over my water glass. The ice had melted completely, leaving the glass sweating condensation rings onto the cheap plastic table. This wasn't where a woman sat to watch her granddaughter celebrate her engagement. This was where help took their breaks. A burst of applause echoed from the main dining room, followed by the distinctive sound of someone tapping a fork against crystal. Speech time. I stood slightly enough to peer through the service window and saw Preston Ashford III approaching the microphone they'd set up near the massive floral arrangements I'd also paid for. White orchids and baby's breath $200 worth of flowers that would be thrown away tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen. Preston's voice boomed with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. Vivian and I are absolutely delighted to welcome you all to celebrate the engagement of our dear Bradley to the lovely Sophia. Our dear Bradley, the lovely Sophia, not our future daughter-in-law. Not Sophia raised with love by her devoted grandmother, just the lovely Sophia, as if she'd appeared from nowhere, parentless and convenient. I sank back into my chair, the metal frame creaking under my weight. Around me, the kitchen staff continued their work, the endless cycle of serving and cleaning that kept these events running smoothly. They were invisible too, I realized. We were all invisible, the people who made things possible, but weren't supposed to be seen. My purse buzzed against my ribs. I pulled out my phone, an iPhone that Sophia had taught me to use last Christmas, and saw a text from my friend Eleanor, who'd driven me to the party. "How's it going, dear? You looked beautiful when you walked in." I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could I possibly explain this? How could I tell my best friend that the granddaughter I'd raised had allowed her future in-laws to banish me to the service area like hired help? That I was currently sitting next to a mop bucket while strangers toasted her future? I typed back, "Lovely party. Sophia looks radiant." It wasn't a lie exactly. Just not the whole truth. The truth would hurt too much to put into words. Preston's speech continued, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. Bradley has shown excellent judgment in choosing a partner who will fit seamlessly into our family's traditions and values. We look forward to many years of happiness together. Fit seamlessly. Like Sophia was a puzzle piece he'd found to complete their perfect picture. I thought about the little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms, who insisted on wearing her tutu to the grocery store, who cried when she accidentally stepped on a caterpillar. That child had been perfectly herself, rough edges and all. When had she learned to sand herself down to fit into someone else's frame? The applause was thunderous, followed by another speaker. Bradley's best man, judging by the young voice and Princeton accent. Then Vivian Ashford herself, her southern drawl dripping with honey and hidden thorns. I simply must share how thrilled we are to gain such a delightful daughter-in-law. Sophia has shown such grace in adapting to our family's way of doing things. She's learned our traditions so quickly, it's as if she was born to them, adapting, learning their traditions. As if everything I'd taught her, every value I'd instilled, every piece of herself she'd carried into this relationship was something to be replaced rather than honored. I closed my eyes and let myself remember a different Sophia. 7 years old, gap-toothed, and fierce, standing up to a playground bully who was picking on a smaller child. "My grandma says we protect people who can't protect themselves," she'd announced, hands on her hips. I'd been so proud that day, proud that something I'd taught her had taken root. Where was that fierce little girl now? Where was the teenager who'd helped me organize food drives at the high school, who'd spent her summers volunteering at the literacy center? When had she learned to smile politely while her chosen family erased the woman who'd raised her? The door swung open, and I caught another glimpse of the party. Sophia was at the microphone now, her cheeks flushed with champagne and excitement. My heart clenched with a familiar mixture of love and loss. She was beautiful, my girl. Beautiful and confident and everything I'd hoped she'd become. But she was also standing 30 feet away from me, speaking to a room full of people who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be honored. "I'm so grateful," Sophia's voice carried clearly through the kitchen noise, "to be joining such an amazing family. The Ashfords have welcomed me with open arms and shown me what true elegance and grace look like. I feel so lucky to be learning from them. Learning from them. Not building on what she'd already learned. Not bringing her own family's love and history into this new chapter. Learning from them as if her first 24 years had been merely preparation for the real education the Ashfords would provide." The coat check girl beside me winced. "Ouch! That's gotta hurt." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat had closed up, and speaking would only release the sob that was building in my chest, like a pressure cooker about to explode. Instead, I opened my purse and pulled out my wallet fingers, finding the worn photo I kept tucked behind my credit cards. Sophia at 8 Gap, still not quite closed, grinning at the camera with chocolate ice cream smeared across her chin. We'd been at the county fair, just the two of us, and she'd insisted on riding the Ferris wheel 6 times in a row because she loved seeing our neighborhood from up high. Grandma Rose. She'd said that day, "When I grow up, I want to live in a house right next to yours so we can see each other every day." I'd laughed and promised her we'd always be close no matter where life took her. I'd believed it then. I'd believed that the bond we'd forged through bedtime stories and homework help and midnight fevers was unbreakable. But sitting in that kitchen, listening to her thank other people for teaching her grace and elegance, I realized that some bonds can be broken simply by wanting to fit into a smaller, shinier box. And sometimes, the people you love most will be the ones to help you squeeze yourself in. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from my banking app, the one Sophia had helped me set up to keep track of my expenses. Automated alert, large transaction posted to checking account. I opened the app with shaking fingers and stared at the screen. $847 charged to Prestige Catering Services. Posted yesterday. I hadn't authorized any additional charges. The party was supposed to be fully paid for weeks ago. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I scrolled through my recent transactions. There it was again, 2 days ago, $650 to Riverside Country Club for audio-visual enhancement. And another from last week, $200 to Ashford Events Consulting for Day of Coordination Services. Ashford Events Consulting. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I'd never heard of this company, but the name wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been using my credit card information to cover additional party expenses charges that weren't part of our original agreement. Charges I'd never approved. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the metal chair. The waiter looked at me with concern. "Está bien, señora? Are you okay?" "I need some air," I managed, clutching my purse against my chest. The kitchen suddenly felt stifling, all bleach fumes and industrial heat. I pushed through the service door that led to the loading dock, away from the party, away from the celebration of my granddaughter's future that I was apparently funding but not welcome to attend. Outside, the October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of the river that ran behind the country club. I fumbled for my phone again and called my bank's customer service line, the number I'd memorized after my husband died, and I'd been forced to learn how to manage our finances alone. "Mrs. Mitchell, how can I help you this evening?" The customer service representative sounded impossibly young and cheerful. "I need to check on some recent charges to my account. I think there may be some fraudulent activity." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Of course, ma'am. Let me pull up your account. I can see the charges you're referring to. The most recent was yesterday evening for 8:47 hours. Before that, we have $650 and $200 all within the past week. Did you authorize these transactions?" "No," I said firmly. "I did not." I see that all 3 charges were made with a card not present transaction, which means they were either online or over the phone. "Do you have any family members or trusted individuals who might have access to your card information?" My throat tightened. "It's possible." "Well, the good news is that we can dispute these charges and begin an investigation. I'll need to cancel your current card and issue a new one, which should arrive within 3 to 5 business days. In the meantime, I can place a fraud alert on your account to prevent any additional unauthorized charges." I closed my eyes and leaned against the brick wall of the country club. Through the windows above me, I could see the warm glow of the party lights, hear the faint sound of music and laughter. My granddaughter was in there celebrating her engagement with money stolen from my account while I stood in a loading dock canceling my credit card. "Yes," I said quietly. "Please do that." After I hung up, I stood in the darkness for a long time, watching my breath cloud in the cool air. 38 years as a high school principal had taught me how to read people, how to spot the small signs that someone wasn't telling the truth. How had I missed this? How had I let myself be so thoroughly manipulated? But I knew the answer. I'd wanted so desperately to be included, to be valued, that I'd ignored every red flag. When Sophia had asked me to pay for the party, I'd been flattered that she trusted me with something so important. When the Ashfords had taken over the planning, I'd told myself they just wanted everything to be perfect. When I'd been gradually excluded from decision-making, I'd convinced myself it was because they wanted to surprise me. I'd been an educator for 4 decades. I'd taught thousands of teenagers to think critically, to question authority, to stand up for themselves. But when it came to my own granddaughter, I'd been as naive as a freshman on the first day of school. The service door opened behind me, and the tired-looking waiter emerged, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. He nodded at me sympathetically. "The party's almost over," he said in accented English. "Maybe another hour. You want me to tell your granddaughter you're out here?" I shook my head. "No, thank you. I think I've seen enough." He took a long drag of his cigarette and studied my face in the dim light from the loading dock. "You know, Señora, I have a grandmother too. 93 years old, raised 8 children by herself after my grandfather died. We would never treat her like this. Never. Every family is different," I said softly. "See, that's true. But respect that should be the same everywhere." He was right, of course. Respect should be universal. But somehow, over the years, I'd taught myself to accept less and less of it. When had I started believing that love meant accepting whatever scraps of attention and consideration my family was willing to offer? I thought about my husband Robert and how he would have reacted to tonight. He'd been a gentleman, soft-spoken and kind, but he'd had a backbone of steel when it came to protecting the people he loved. He never would have let me sit in a kitchen while my own granddaughter celebrated 30 feet away. He would have marched into that dining room, consequences be damned, and taken his rightful place at our granddaughter's side. But Robert was gone, had been gone for 8 years now, and I'd been navigating this world alone, making mistake after mistake in my desperate attempt to maintain connection with the only family I had left. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Eleanor's name appeared on the screen. "Rose, dear, I'm outside in the parking lot. Are you ready to go?"
The valet said the party is winding down.
I looked up at the windows above me, where the warm light still glowed, and the celebration continued without me. Yes, I said. I'm ready, but I wasn't ready to go home and pretend this hadn't happened. I wasn't ready to wake up tomorrow and continue being the grandmother who could be discarded whenever she became inconvenient. I wasn't ready to let them keep my money and my silence while giving me nothing but shame in return. Eleanor. I said, do you remember when we were 25 and you told your mother-in-law exactly what you thought of her meddling? Oh my! Eleanor laughed. I certainly do. Why do you ask?
I think it's time I found my backbone again.
I walked back into the country club through the main entrance this time, not the service door. My heels clicked against the marble floor with purpose, and I held my head high as I approached the maitre d' who had seated me in the kitchen. Excuse me, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd perfected during 40 years of dealing with difficult teenagers and their parents. I need to make an announcement to the party. His eyes widened. Ma'am, I don't think... I'm not asking for permission, I said calmly. I'm informing you of what's about to happen. I pushed through the dining room doors before he could respond. The party was indeed winding down, but there were still about 60 people scattered around the elegant space, nursing final glasses of champagne and picking at the dessert display. Sophia was near the gift table, laughing with a group of bridesmaids, while Bradley chatted with his groomsmen near the bar. I walked directly to the microphone, my heart pounding, but my steps steady. The room gradually fell silent as people noticed the gray-haired woman in the navy dress approaching the front of the room. Excuse me, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. I'm Rose Mitchell, Sophia's grandmother. Sophia's head snapped up, her face going pale as she saw me standing there. The Ashfords clustered near the head table looked like they'd swallowed something unpleasant. I wanted to thank you all for coming to celebrate my granddaughter's engagement. I continued, my teacher's voice projecting to every corner of the room. It's been lovely to see Sophia so happy, surrounded by people who clearly care about her. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people smiled politely, unsure where this was going. I also wanted to clarify a few things, I said, pulling my phone from my purse. I've been funding this evening's celebration as well as several additional expenses that were charged to my account without my knowledge or consent. I've just spoken with my bank to dispute these fraudulent charges and cancel my credit card. The silence in the room was deafening. Sophia's face had gone from pale to green, and Preston Ashford looked like he was about to have a stroke. Going forward, I continued, my voice never wavering. I won't be contributing financially to any wedding-related expenses. I also won't be attending the wedding, as it's become clear that my presence is considered more of an obligation than a celebration. Someone gasped. I think it might have been one of the bridesmaids. Shh, Sophia, sweetheart, I said, looking directly at my granddaughter, who was now crying silently. I love you more than you'll ever know. I raised you to be kind, honest, and strong. I hope someday you'll remember those lessons. I set the microphone back in its stand and walked toward the exit, my head held high. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting. Voices raised in confusion and anger, chairs scraping against the floor, someone calling my name. But I didn't turn around. I'd said what I needed to say, and now I was leaving on my own terms. Eleanor was waiting in her car, outside, engine running. I slid into the passenger seat and closed the door, shutting out the noise and drama I'd left behind. How do you feel? Eleanor asked gently as we pulled out of the parking lot. I thought about it for a moment, watching the country club disappear in the side mirror. Free, I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel free. The phone calls started at 7 the next morning. First, Sophia sobbing into my voicemail about how embarrassed she was, how I'd ruined everything. How could I be so cruel? Then Bradley, awkward and stilted, asking if we could work this out like adults. Finally, Preston Ashford himself, his voice dripping with barely controlled rage, demanding that I call him back immediately to discuss my unacceptable behavior. I deleted each message without listening to it completely. Instead, I made myself a pot of coffee and sat on my back porch, watching the sun rise over the oak trees that Robert had planted when we'd first bought this house 45 years ago. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe deeply. My phone rang again. This time, it was my lawyer, Margaret Hoffman, a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd helped me navigate Robert's estate and had become something of a friend over the years. Rose, I just got a very interesting call from Preston Ashford's attorney. Something about disputed charges and a disrupted social event. Care to fill me in? I told her everything from the kitchen seating to the unauthorized charges to my impromptu speech. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making small humming sounds that told me she was taking notes. Well, she said when I finished, you certainly didn't do anything illegal. Morally questionable, perhaps, depending on your perspective, but not illegal. The credit card charges, however, those are a different matter entirely. That's fraud, pure and simple. I don't want to press charges against Sophia, I said quickly. It may not have been Sophia who made the charges, Margaret pointed out. These Ashford Events consulting charges suggest someone set up a company specifically to bill you for wedding expenses. That takes a level of premeditation that goes beyond a granddaughter asking for help with party costs. The thought hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense. Sophia was many things, but she wasn't sophisticated enough to create a fake consulting company. Someone else had orchestrated this, someone who knew exactly how to manipulate both of us. What do you think I should do? I asked. Legally, you should let the bank's fraud investigation run its course. Personally, Margaret paused. I think you should be proud of yourself for finally standing up. I've watched too many elderly clients get taken advantage of by family members who see them as ATMs rather than people. You did the right thing. After I hung up, I spent the morning doing things I'd been putting off for months. I organized my financial documents, updated my will to reflect my current feelings about family obligations, and made a list of local charities that could benefit from the money I'd been planning to spend on wedding expenses. Around noon, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Sophia standing on my porch, still in yesterday's clothes, her makeup smeared and her hair falling out of its elegant updo. She looked younger than her 24 years, more like the heartbroken teenager I'd comforted through her first serious breakup. Grandma Rose, she said, her voice hoarse from crying. Please, can we talk? I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she avoided meeting my eyes as she walked past me into the living room. She sat on the edge of the sofa, perched like she was ready to flee at any moment. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I'm so sorry about last night. About the seating, about the charges, about all of it. Which part are you sorry about specifically? I asked, settling into my armchair across from her. Are you sorry that it happened, or sorry that I found out? She flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it Sophia you sat there and watched them put me in the kitchen? You gave a speech about how grateful you were to be learning grace and elegance from the Ashfords, while the woman who raised you was sitting next to a mop bucket. You let them steal money from my account to pay for services I never approved. Which part of that was accidental? I didn't know about the charges, she said quickly. I swear I didn't. That was all Preston's idea. He said wealthy families had ways of managing expenses, and he'd handle the details. I thought he was just being generous. And the seating arrangement, she was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Vivian said it would be better for the photos if we kept the head table small, just immediate family. She said you'd understand. Immediate family, I repeated. The people who raised you apparently don't count as immediate family? That's not what I meant. Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. You know you're my family. You're the most important person in my life.
Am I because last night I felt like hired help who'd outlived her usefulness?
She started crying, then quiet tears that reminded me so much of the little girl who used to climb into my lap when she was sad. Despite everything, my heart ached for her. This wasn't entirely her fault, I knew that. She was young and in love, and desperate to fit into a world that had always been closed to people like us. "I don't know how to fix this," she sobbed. "Bradley's parents are furious. They're saying you deliberately sabotaged the party to get attention. Vivian wants to disinvite you from the wedding, and Preston is talking about pressing charges for disrupting a private event."
Let them, I said calmly. I spoke the truth. If they can't handle that, it says more about them than it does about me.
"But I need you there, Grandma. I can't get married without you." "You were already planning to get married without me, sweetheart. You were just going to let me pay for the privilege of being excluded." She looked up at me, then her hazel eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "What can I do? How can I make this right?" I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. "You can start by deciding who you want to be, Sophia. The woman I raised who stood up to bullies and helped feed hungry families, or the woman who lets other people treat her grandmother like an embarrassment while funding their lifestyle?" "I want to be both," she said. "I want to fit into Bradley's world, but I don't want to lose you." "Sometimes you can't have both," I said gently. "Sometimes you have to choose between what's comfortable and what's right." She was quiet for a long time, and I could see her wrestling with the decision. Part of me wanted to make it easier for her to offer some compromise that would let her keep one foot in each world. But I'd spent too many years compromising, accepting less than I deserved in the name of keeping peace. Finally, she spoke. "If I stand up to them, if I insist on treating you the way you deserve to be treated, they might call off the engagement."
That's possible, I agreed.
"And if I don't, then you'll have a lovely wedding funded by guilt money, surrounded by people who see your grandmother as a problem to be managed. And eventually you'll teach your own children that love is conditional on how well you fit into other people's expectations." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked my garden. "This is so hard, Grandma. I love him so much, and I thought his family would learn to love me too if I just tried hard enough to be what they wanted." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, my heart breaking for her. "You can't earn love by erasing yourself. Trust me, I've tried." She turned back to me, and for a moment I saw the fierce little girl who'd stood up to playground bullies. "What if I told them that either they treat you with respect or I walk away?"
That's your choice to make, I said. But you need to be prepared for the possibility that they'll call your bluff.
"And if they do, then you'll know where you really stood with them all along." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I need to think about this. Can I come back tomorrow after I've had time to process everything?" "Of course," I said, standing to walk her to the door. "You're always welcome here, Sophia. That hasn't changed." She hugged me then, fierce and desperate, like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. "I love you, Grandma Rose. Whatever happens, I need you to know that."
I love you too, baby girl, more than you'll ever know.
After she left, I made myself a sandwich and sat back down on the porch, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across my yard. My phone had stopped ringing, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. Either the Ashfords had decided to cut their losses, or they were regrouping for a more serious counterattack. But for the first time in months, I wasn't worried about what other people were planning. I'd found my voice again, and I wasn't going to let anyone silence it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friends from the school district and invited them over for dinner. Not because I needed their support or sympathy, but because I wanted to celebrate with people who'd known me when I was strong, before I'd forgotten how to stand up for myself. They came bearing casseroles and wine and stories about their own family dramas, and we sat around my dining room table until well past midnight, laughing until our cheeks hurt. These women had seen me through Robert's death, Sophia's teenage rebellion, and countless professional challenges. They'd never made me feel like I needed to earn my place at their table. As I cleaned up the dishes, I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not conditional acceptance based on how well you fit someone else's vision, but unconditional love that celebrated who you were, rather than trying to change you into someone else. The next morning brought a knock on my door. I opened it to find not Sophia, but Bradley himself, looking nervous and contrite in his pressed khakis and polo shirt. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said formally, "I wonder if I might have a word with you." I let him in and offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. He sat on the same sofa where Sophia had cried yesterday, but his posture was different, straighter, more determined. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "What happened at the engagement party was unacceptable, and I should have spoken up." "Why didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious. He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Because I'm a coward," he said finally. "Because I've spent my whole life being told that keeping the peace is more important than doing what's right. Because it was easier to go along with my parents than to fight them." It was an honest answer, more honest than I'd expected from him. "But last night," he continued, "Sophia told me what you said to her, about choosing who she wants to be, and it made me realize that I have the same choice to make." "And what did you decide?" "I decided that I'd rather be the kind of man who stands up for the people he loves than the kind who lets them be mistreated for the sake of appearances." He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of Sophia at her best. Determination mixed with vulnerability. "I told my parents this morning that either they apologize to you and treat you with the respect you deserve, or Sophia and I will pay for our own wedding and they can stay home." "How did they take that?" He laughed ruefully. "About as well as you'd expect. My mother fainted, and my father threatened to cut me off financially. But you know what? I realized I don't care anymore. I'd rather be poor with Sophia than rich and miserable." "And Sophia? How does she feel about this?" "She's terrified," he admitted. "But she's also proud. She said it was the first time in months that she'd seen the man she fell in love with." I studied his face, looking for signs of uncertainty or resentment. But all I saw was sincerity and determination. Maybe there was hope for this boy after all. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we start over," he said. "We plan a wedding that reflects who we actually are instead of who my parents think we should be. We invite people who love us, not just people who look good in photos, and we make sure the most important woman in Sophia's life has a seat at the head table where she belongs." Despite everything, I felt tears prick my eyes. "That sounds lovely, Bradley." "There's just one problem," he said, looking embarrassed. "We don't actually have any money. I've been living off my trust fund, and my parents have frozen my access to it. Sophia's salary barely covers her rent. We can't afford the kind of wedding we'd planned." "Good," I said firmly. "The best weddings aren't about money anyway. They're about love and commitment and celebrating with people who matter." "Would you?" He hesitated. "Would you consider helping us plan something smaller? Something real? I know we have no right to ask after everything that's happened, but—" "Bradley," I interrupted gently. "I'd be honored." And that's how I found myself 3 months later, standing in my own backyard, under a canopy of string lights and autumn leaves, watching my granddaughter marry a man who'd learned to choose love over convenience. The guest list was smaller. The flowers were from my garden, and the cake was made by my friend Eleanor, who'd refused to accept payment. But when Sophia walked down the makeshift aisle in her simple white dress, her face glowing with happiness, I knew this was exactly what a wedding should be. Not a performance for people who didn't matter, but a celebration of two people brave enough to build a life together on their own terms. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Sophia caught my eye and mouthed, "Thank you." Not for the money this time, but for teaching her that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept less than you deserve. Later, as we danced under the stars to music played from a borrowed speaker, Bradley's parents arrived unexpectedly. They stood at the edge of my property, dressed in formal attire that looked ridiculous at our casual gathering, clearly expecting to be invited in. "What should we do?" Sophia whispered, noticing them at the same time I did. I looked at the Ashfords standing there in their expensive clothes and entitled expressions, and felt nothing but pity. They'd chosen appearances over love, and now they were watching their son's wedding from behind a fence like strangers. "It's your wedding," I told Sophia. "It's your choice." She looked at her new husband, who shrugged and said, "Whatever you want, sweetheart." Sophia walked over to the property line, beautiful and confident in her simple dress. I couldn't hear what she said to them, but I saw Preston's face turn red and Vivian's expression harden. After a few minutes, they turned and walked back to their car without another word. When Sophia returned to the dance floor, I asked what she'd told them. "I said they were welcome to stay if they could apologize to you and mean it," she said. "Otherwise, they could leave." "And they chose to leave." "They chose to leave," she confirmed. "But you know what? I'm not sad about it. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again." As the evening wound down and the last guests said their goodbyes, I found myself sitting on my porch swing, watching Bradley and Sophia clean up the fairy lights we'd strung through the trees. They moved together easily, laughing at some private joke, looking every inch the happy couple they truly were. Sophia had changed out of her wedding dress and into jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked like the girl I'd raised, confident and kind and unafraid to get her hands dirty. The society princess act was gone, replaced by something much more valuable: authenticity. "Grandma Rose," she called, carrying a box of decorations toward the house. "Thank you for everything. Not just tonight, but for teaching me that I'm worth more than what other people think of me." "You taught yourself that, sweetheart," I replied. "I just reminded you of what you already knew." As they drove away for their honeymoon, a modest camping trip to the mountains rather than the European tour the Ashfords had planned, I sat in the quiet darkness of my porch, surrounded by the lingering scent of gardenias and the memory of laughter. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Beautiful wedding, dear. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." I was proud too. Not just for finding my voice, but for remembering that love shouldn't require you to make yourself smaller. That respect isn't something you have to earn over and over again, but something you deserve simply by being human. The country club engagement party felt like a lifetime ago now, but I could still remember the smell of industrial bleach and the sound of dishes clattering in the kitchen where they'd hidden me away. I'd sat in that folding chair and accepted their cruelty because I thought it was the price of staying connected to the granddaughter I loved. But real love doesn't demand that kind of sacrifice. Real love doesn't ask you to disappear so other people can shine brighter. Real love celebrates who you are not, who you might become, if you just try hard enough to be someone else. As I locked up the house and prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked the same as I had 6 months ago, but something fundamental had changed. I stood straighter now, met my own eyes without flinching. I'd remembered what it felt like to take up space in the world to speak truth, even when it was uncomfortable to demand better, because I was worth it. Sophia would be fine. She'd married a man who was learning to be worthy of her, and she'd found the courage to choose authenticity over approval. But more importantly, she'd learned that lesson early enough to build a marriage on honesty rather than performance. As for me, I'd learned something too, that it's never too late to remember who you are underneath all the roles you've played. Mother, wife, grandmother, educator. All of those were parts of me, but they weren't the whole story. I was also a woman who deserved respect, who had valuable things to say, who could command a room when necessary. I'd spent too many years sitting quietly while other people decided my worth. But those days were over. I'd found my voice again, and I wasn't planning to lose it anytime soon. The morning after the wedding, I woke up to a house full of sunlight and the lingering scent of gardenias from my garden. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace. Not just content, but genuinely happy in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. I made myself a proper breakfast, eggs Benedict and fresh fruit and coffee that actually tasted good, and ate it on my back porch while reading a novel I'd been meaning to get to for months. No rushing, no obligations, no need to check my phone every 5 minutes to see if someone needed something from me. This was what freedom felt like. Around noon, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a delivery man with an enormous bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. The card was from Preston and Vivian Ashford, and it was exactly what I'd expected, a stiff, formal apology that managed to sound more like they were doing me a favor than expressing genuine remorse. I thanked the delivery man, carried the flowers to my kitchen, and promptly threw them in the garbage. Some bridges once burned weren't worth rebuilding. But later that afternoon, another delivery arrived, this one much smaller. A single potted orchid with a handwritten note from Bradley and Sophia. "Thank you for teaching us what real grace looks like. We love you, Grandma Rose." I placed the orchid on my windowsill where the afternoon sun would help it bloom, and I smiled. Because that's what real love looks like. Not grand gestures designed to impress others, but small, thoughtful acts that say, "I see you, I value you, you matter." As I watered the orchid and adjusted its position to catch the best light, I thought about the lessons I'd learned over the past few months. About the difference between being wanted and being convenient. About the courage it takes to disappoint people who've never really seen you anyway. About the peace that comes from finally putting yourself first. I'd raised my granddaughter to be strong and kind and authentic, and she'd taught me that those same qualities applied to grandmothers too. That you're never too old to remember your worth, never too set in your ways to demand better, never too afraid of being alone to accept being invisible. The orchid was beautiful, delicate, but resilient, and as I watched the late afternoon sunlight illuminate its petals, I realized it was the perfect metaphor for what I'd become. Not the hardy, dependable Rose I'd always thought I was, but something more elegant, more selective about where I chose to bloom. I'd spent too many years being the reliable background flower adding color to other people's gardens while forgetting to tend my own. But now, I was learning to be more discerning to save my blooms for people who would appreciate their beauty rather than take them for granted. As the sun set over my small but perfect garden, I sat on my porch swing and called Eleanor to tell her about the flowers, both the ones I'd thrown away and the one I'd kept. We laughed about the absurdity of the Ashfords' apology and made plans for dinner later in the week. "You know," Eleanor said before we hung up, "I've never seen you this happy. It suits you." She was right. Happiness did suit me, and I was finally old enough and wise enough to choose it over the alternatives. Not the shallow happiness that comes from other people's approval, but the deep abiding contentment that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. The engagement party that had started this whole journey felt like something that had happened to someone else now. I could barely remember the taste of humiliation that had filled my mouth as I sat in that kitchen, watching other people celebrate my granddaughter's future while I remained invisible and forgotten. But I remembered perfectly the feeling of standing up and walking to that microphone, of speaking my truth in front of people who'd tried to silence me. I remembered the power in my own voice, the strength in my own convictions, the freedom that came from finally choosing myself. That was the woman I was now, and the woman I would remain. Not perfect, not always comfortable, but authentic and unapologetic and utterly, completely free.